So yesterday I was saying that the way we can understand Holy Week is as an exploration of really the fundamental issues of human life and meaning. There's one story, one person that unfolds in a limited period of time. But the Gospel writers give a huge amount of space and time to these last hours of Jesus' life. There's lots of other things we'd like to know, perhaps, about Jesus' life and teaching. But the passion of Christ that we remember and relive in Holy Week receives in a sense, disproportionate amount of time and space. In much the same way, perhaps, that we will always remember the last hours or the last days that you spent with your parents, if they were dying, or people you love, or a spouse who's dying. You will always remember those last days or weeks or hours because they seem to concentrate time and concentrate the relationship. And the relationship goes through tremendous accelerated development, at times anyway, in the dying process. So human beings, the relationships between human beings I was talking about yesterday can really be sort of intensely deepened and developed in a short space of time. You'll be living with someone for 20 years or 30 years, and then somehow in those last few days or weeks or months of life, it goes through an amazing intensification. So the Gospel writers give a lot of time and attention to those last days of Jesus' life. And it's not just the individual, but as we saw yesterday, there are lots of questions we would like to answer from a biographical point of view. Why did Judas betray Jesus? And so on. And yet, in a way, what we don't know and what the Gospels are silent about are also very meaningful. Because if we had all the psychological, personal, biographical details, we would be distracted, perhaps, from the universality of the story. And the way we have it, the way we enter into the story, with the basic elements, the basic details, allows us to find ourselves in it. And we won't find Jesus in Holy Week unless we find ourselves in the story as well, or first of all. So yesterday we looked at what the Last Supper, the first chapter of the Holy Week story, tells us about the fundamental question of human relationships, our need for relationship and our need to belong in community. And today I'd like to look at justice, the second scene, in a way, of the Passion narrative after the Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane is the trial of Jesus, and what that tells us about the human hunger for justice and our need for justice. So just to remind you of it, let's just listen to this first description in the Gospel of Luke. This was after Jesus had been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and taken at night, in the middle of the night. That's when injustice is usually committed, in the middle of the night, under cover of darkness, taken to the high priest's house, and Peter then denies Jesus at a distance 3 times. Jesus is blindfolded and beaten and mocked and insulted And when day broke, the elders of the nation, the chief priests and the doctors of the law, so all the establishment figures, all the powerful forces of society, assembled, and he was brought before their council. "Tell us," they said, "are you the Messiah?" "If I tell you," he replied, "you will not believe me. And if I ask questions, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of Almighty God." "You are the Son of God, then," they all said. And he replied, "It is you who say I am." And they said, "Do we need to call further witnesses? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips." So this is a false trial. With that, the whole assembly rose, and they brought him before Pilate, because they had to get Pilate, the Roman governor, to issue the legal decree of execution. So they opened their case against Jesus by saying, "We found this man subverting our nation, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming to be Messiah, a king." So they're twisting the evidence in order to give Pilate legal grounds for condemning Jesus. So this is the worst kind of operation of law. It's where law is being abused and twisted, and this is the jokes we make about lawyers who twist the facts. But it's not so funny if you're on the other side of the case. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He replied, "The words are yours." Pilate then said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no case for this man to answer." So Pilate presumably saw through this false trial. He knew that these intensely religious people, so unlike the Romans, who took religion so seriously, they were ganging up on Jesus. They wanted to use Pilate in order to execute Jesus. And he didn't just want to get involved. "I find no case for this man to answer," but they insisted. "His teaching is causing disaffection among the people all through Judea." So they're saying to Pilate, "Well, okay, if you let him off, you're going to have political trouble." And it started from Galilee and has spread as far as this city. Jesus, as we know, took no political position, although he was misinterpreted sometimes as being a political figure, because he had a real influence on the crowds. But his teaching is, in a sense, not politically controversial. When Pilate heard this, he asked if the man was a Galilean, and on learning that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he remitted the case to him, for Herod was also in Jerusalem at the time. So we see the complexity of bureaucracy, and Pilate wants to hand over this responsibility to Herod. He doesn't want to really be responsible for executing this insignificant troublemaker, but let Herod deal with him. When Herod saw Jesus, he was really pleased, because he had heard about him and had long been wanting to see him, and had been hoping to see some miracle performed by him. So Herod, now who's going to hold the life and death of Jesus in his hands, is a typical man of power who's just kind of interested in amusement, and read about Jesus in the newspapers and would like to see if he's capable of working some miracles. So terrible trivialization of human justice. He questioned him at some length, but without getting any reply. So Jesus doesn't reply. How can you reply meaningfully to someone who is so superficial, so uninterested in justice, in truth? So we see the silence of Jesus throughout this trial, as one of its strongest features. The way to tell the truth when everybody is telling lies around you is to be silent. The chief priests and the lawyers appeared and pressed the case against Jesus vigorously. Then Herod and his troops treated him with contempt and ridicule. So Jesus didn't amuse Herod, didn't perform any miracles, and so he's boring, and so let's just get rid of him. Yeah, okay. Sent him back to Pilate, dressed in a gorgeous robe. So the humiliation. Okay, they say he's a king, so let's dress him up like a king. So he's not only being treated unjustly, he's being humiliated. Simone Weil makes a distinction between suffering and affliction. Suffering is when you can have a toothache, or you have a temporary pain. It could be physical, it could even be emotional. And it passes, and you're not changed by that pain. Once the toothache is over, you go back to normal life. But affliction, she says, is when the suffering enters into your very identity, and you are stripped of your human dignity, your human meaning. So slavery, for example, is a form of affliction. And some kinds of suffering in life that take away our dignity, our basic human rights, we might say. This is what she means by affliction. This is what the Passion of Christ is about, not just physical suffering. There was a film a few years ago, The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, which I judged but didn't see, because when I heard that there was a 20-minute scene of him being scourged, and knowing Gibson's other rather sadistic films, I thought I wasn't really interested, or some people found it very moving and so on. But anyway, he put all the emphasis, so it seems, on the physical suffering. And much of Christian Western art does the same thing. It really focuses on the scourging and the crown of thorns and the pain and so on, and the crucifixion. And the pain and the suffering were clearly there. But actually the Gospels don't give it a great deal of time or attention. They don't go into graphic detail like Mel Gibson did. And that's because the really significant, meaningful aspect of the Passion of Christ is not just the physical suffering. That's of course meaningful and part of it, but it's the total destruction of the human being in all their relationships or in their social identity. It's the attempt to destroy a person's identity. That's what's happening. That's the real death. So Herod and Pilate became friends that day. Interesting. These two figures of power and influence, both of them finding themselves briefly relating to this insignificant Galilean miracle worker and religious teacher, just for a few moments, and both of them failing in their duty to protect justice, to protect the individual. Both of them the real criminals in the story, and they become friends that day. It's an unholy friendship. Until then, there had been a standing feud between them. So they were enemies before that. So they're brought together in this strange way by the injustice that they are both part of. Pilate then called together the chief priests, councillors, and the people, and said to them, "You brought this man before me on a charge of subversion, but I've examined him in your presence, and I find nothing in him to support your charges." So Pilate is still trying to get out of it. And he says Herod didn't find anything against him, and he referred him back to us. So they're just sending Jesus from one to the other. Nobody really wants to take responsibility. Clearly he has done nothing to deserve death, Pilate says. So he says the truth. I therefore propose to let him off with a flogging. So we'll just beat him, and that will be enough. But there was a general outcry. Away with him, give us Barabbas. This was a man who had been put in prison for a political rising and for murder. So he was the criminal. But they wanted Barabbas freed and Jesus punished. Pilate addressed them again in his desire to release Jesus. This is very strong in Luke, trying to put Pilate in a good light. But they shouted back, "Crucify him, crucify him." And for the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What wrong has he done? I had not found him guilty of any capital offence. I will therefore let him off with a flogging." So Pilate is a lawyer. He's there to carry out the laws, and it's what he's done, whatever Jesus has done, it doesn't merit under Roman law that he should be executed. But they insisted that he should be crucified, and they prevailed, and Pilate decided they should have their way. So Pilate now gives in, surrenders to this lust for blood, for this scapegoating of Jesus, for the rule of the mob, for trial by the media, we might say, rather than due process of law. And he released the man that they asked for, Barabbas, the criminal, and he gave Jesus over to them, and he was executed. So this is the story that says something to us very powerfully, I think, about the fundamental element in human life, in all of us, our need for justice. So yesterday we looked at the fundamental human questions of Holy Weeks and Holy Week highlights these fundamentals of human meaning dramatically, very dramatically. We looked at human relationships and our need to belong to community. We saw that human growth and development will inevitably be painful. Romantic love and happy days spent with picnics with friends happen, but they're only part of the picture. The factor of the ego, the separation anxiety, the fact of separation, the need to separate that is built into our ego, is hard to control, and it causes the dark side of love. And betrayal, as we saw yesterday, is the worst aspect of it, it's the darkest side of it. Half of all women killed in Western society are killed by their intimate partners. Half of all women are killed by their husbands or partners. So the dark side of love. The Last Supper takes us into the mystery of communion, the capacity that we have as human beings to give ourselves to others. and therefore to create communion. But it also shows us the reality of excommunication, where we separate and break that, or shatter that communion. So the next scene, as I said, is the way Jesus was arrested under cover of darkness, beaten up by the police, tortured, pushed through a kangaroo court where the evidence is fake and the authorities have prejudged, predetermined the outcome, the judgment. You see this all the time in totalitarian regimes. The Moscow trials in the Soviet Union, when Stalin took over, he just eliminated all his enemies, but he wanted to go through the appearance of legal process, so he just put them through trial and they were mostly executed. The link between the Last Supper and the trial of Jesus is the act of betrayal. Is Judas leading the police, soldiers, into the Garden of Gethsemane in the middle of the night, and he identifies Jesus with a kiss. One of the most famous symbols of the story, the traitor's kiss. So this is the link, as it were, between one theme and the next. So the next fundamental human question that the Holy Week process reveals is this inescapable need for justice, but how we can also so easily betray justice, as we saw Pilate and Herod doing, and all the authorities, all the religious authorities and the crowd, everybody ganging up and betraying that fundamental instinct for justice that is in the human heart. And it's so fundamental. You know, when you, if you treat a child unfairly, you know, if a child is expecting equal amounts of a cake and with other children, and for some reason you give more cake to one child than the other, the look on the child's face who gets the smaller portion is shock and outrage, but first of all just surprise, because this is not how it should be. This is wrong. That's what we say, but it's wrong. And there's this instinctive reaction in us against injustice. Now, a child will simply say, this is unfair, I should have more cake. If you're in Moscow in the 1920s or 30s, you don't speak out. Or if you were in Jerusalem on Good Friday, you don't go against the crowd, because you know what will happen to you if you stood up in the crowd and said, no, this is unjust. Jesus is the innocent one, and let Barabbas take his punishment, but let Jesus go free. All he did was tell people to love one another. If you'd done that, what would happen to you? So, but a child has this instinctive courage, in a way, to stand up for what is obviously right. We expect to be treated justly. Simone Weil understood this, and she related it to the central element of her mystical philosophy and her political theory. She was a Jewish intellectual, died in 1943, I think, in England during the war, one of the great minds and one of the great religious philosophers and mystics, really, of the 20th century. Great prophet, really. And perhaps her single deepest idea that affects both her religious philosophy and her political thinking is the idea of attention, paying attention. She says attention purifies. She says the highest level of attention is prayer. So when we sit and face the crowd of our thoughts and we try to pay attention to the mantra, we are doing this fundamental human work that makes us human and allows us to develop, allows us to grow, allows us to get out of the crowd, allows us to become fully ourselves. The highest level of attention is pure prayer. So, but she also says, as we know from our meditation, true attention is a state so difficult for any human creature that any emotional disturbance can derail it. So, you just have to be worried about something, frightened about something, hurt by something, angry about something. A strong human emotion is going to disturb your capacity to pay attention. And therefore, this is quoting Simone Weil again, one must always endeavour strenuously to protect one's inner faculty of judgment against the turmoil of personal hopes and fears. So what is she saying? It's going to be constant work, every day, some days more easily than others, to protect your faculty of judgment, so your clarity of mind, your ability to see the truth, and your ability to stand by the truth, to face the truth. Remember in the Gospel, one of the Gospels, Pilate says, Jesus says to Pilate, I had come to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate, who's the consummate politician, kind of mockingly says, truth? What's the truth? Truth is whether you can persuade people about something or not. The truth is whether you get your way. Truth is, in politics, is something you can manipulate, and truth is what you want it to be. That isn't truth in the way that Jesus talks about it, or not truth in the way that we experience it in meditation. The truth of ourselves, our true self, the truth, as Jesus said, that sets you free. Free from what? Free from the domination of the ego. Free from the prejudice, the prejudging of our emotions and disordered states. So one must always try hard, she says, to protect this inner faculty of judgment against the turmoil of personal hopes and fears. Well, that's exactly what we do in meditation. We sit down and we are confronted with our turmoil of hopes and fears and emotions. And we do the work of attention in the middle of all of that in order to be our true self. We know that, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who's a therapist, and we were talking about the difference between or the different approaches in a way between meditation and therapy. And it seems to me that in therapy, you see, you do focus specifically on your feelings and on your memories and what's happened to you, what you felt about what happened to you. And that's part of the work of therapy, that should be brought into consciousness. But in meditation, which is also therapeutic and healing, but it's a different approach. Because in meditation, you lay aside those feelings. You don't repress them. You have to acknowledge them, but you don't focus on them during the meditation. This is the hard work of meditation. Strenuously endeavouring, as Simone Weil says. Hard work, but good work and productive work. So we lay aside our thoughts, our words, our imagination, our memories, our feelings, as they arise. And of course afterwards, you may need to recall them and examine your feelings and deal with your thoughts and your imagination and your memories. At other times you do. For the time of meditation, you're doing this pure work of attention, which takes you to a deeper truth. The deepest truth, which is not an opinion, not an idea. It's not even a judgment. It's really justice itself. So justice in many cultures is represented by the symbol, usually a female symbol, of balance. In Egyptian mythology, when you die, your heart is taken out, and your heart is put on the scales, and on one scale, and on the other scale is a feather. And it's the feather of the goddess who symbolizes truth. So your heart is balanced with all the weight of your life experience, is balanced against this feather of truth. And if your heart is judged by the goddess not to be pure, the goddess would eat it. It devours your heart. And the person is then not allowed to continue their journey into immortality. They remain restless in this in-between world. They are unloved and belong nowhere. In Christian understanding, it is into this realm of consciousness that Jesus enters after his death. This is what is happening in those 3 days after his death. He descends into hell, and what does that mean? Well, it means that if we have had our heart eaten, and we end up in this realm of suffering, I'm talking about this life, we don't know about the next life. Anything we say about the next life is really, there's more relevance to this life. So if that has happened to us, and that's where we are, as we will find the redemptive presence of Jesus there. He is already there, he's already been there, and he's waiting for us. So in every culture there is this sense that justice is about balancing, and if there's an imbalance, then there is a price to pay. There is suffering or punishment, karma that must be endured. In London, at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, and on the top of the building there's a statue of Justice, a female figure, and she's blindfolded, and she's holding scales in which the truth of the evidence has to be carefully weighed. And the blindfolding refers to the impartiality of justice. What Simone Weil says about being detached from your turmoil of personal hopes and fears. The fears, hopes and passions that the crowd and the authorities in the trial of Jesus were showing. So to understand justice, we need to understand balance. And it's not just a kind of a broad compromise kind of balance. It's the knife edge of truth. Truth is very sharp, very precise. Truth can hurt, it can cut you. It's like a scalpel, but it is healing. Normally, when we think of justice today, we think of it in terms of human rights. What are my rights? That's how we've been trained, and one of the great outcomes of the 20th century was this Declaration of Human Rights. But that's only half the story. Simone Weil again says that to understand justice we need to see the balance between obligations and rights. A right, a human right, and we're very quick to defend our rights, but a human right doesn't have any meaning by itself. It exists in relationship to an obligation. You can't separate rights and obligations. And we discover that as we learn about relationships and as we live in community and as we try and be responsible citizens. If we only focus on rights, we will find that democracy begins to degenerate as it is doing in our time, with fewer and fewer people who believe in democracy and more fake versions of democracy. If we only concentrate on my rights, we become both individually unbalanced and self-centered and miserable as a result, but also the world we live in, or the society we live in, or the community we live in, or the marriage we live in, also becomes unbalanced and dysfunctional. So justice requires a balance in human relationships, both personal, of course, but also in social contracts, the way one part of society relates to another. Human relationships are all governed by laws, certain laws. Not just legal laws operated by the justice system or the legal system, but now we understand that human relationships are also governed by psychological laws that we don't invent, and that we will find ourselves experiencing in any relationship, personal or collective. It's not only about morality and willpower, justice. It's not just about saying what is right and what's wrong and defending it and having a strong will and commitment. People get very passionate about causes, and much of modern democracy is characterized by particular causes or one-issue politics. In America, for example, this happened, it was in the 80s or the 90s, gay marriage and abortion became the issues that changed American politics. Important issues, moral issues, but single issues that become obsessive when they're not related to the whole picture. So, it's not only about moral questions, moral judgment, but justice is also affected by our personal capacity to be present to the other, to be detached from our own passions and our own opinions even, to be balanced and other-centered. So at every level, in personal relationships and in society, justice must begin interiorly. There is a spiritual dimension to justice. And if there needs to be a critical mass of people who are aware of this for there to be a just society. And there is no peace without justice. So laws are okay. Laws are fundamental structures through which all relationships operate. And they have to be obeyed. If we don't obey them, we commit abuse, injustice. We hurt people, usually the most vulnerable, or children. And in communities or in societies, to be disobedient to these fundamental laws, the Ten Commandments, for example, are an expression of those fundamental laws. The Dhammapada gives us a Buddhist expression of some of those fundamental laws of human meaning, human relationship. If we don't obey those laws, we create injustice and imbalance in ourselves and therefore in all our relationships. In terms of society and organizations, it's better to have bad laws than no laws. So we have to be continually checking that the laws and rules and regulations by which we govern ourselves are the most appropriate, and we can change laws. But while the laws are there, we need to obey them, unless they are extremely and obscenely unjust, like the laws against the Jews in Nazi Germany. But basically, if we had no laws, we are totally isolated. We're condemned to a continual domination by the ego factor of separation, and we are constantly betraying each other. So we need laws, but we need to know the deep laws of life, the deep laws of the spirit. To be obedient to these deep laws not just to the social conventions that change. Many things that are legal today we take for granted 50 years ago or 100 years ago were regarded as terrible crimes. Yeah. Today, a great majority of people would say if same-sex relations are perfectly acceptable. Not 50 years ago, you would be put in prison for same-sex relationships. So conventions change, moral opinions change, but fundamental laws is what we are always trying to get to, and we want our civil laws, our social regulations, to be as close as possible to these fundamental laws of the Spirit. And therefore they need continuous refinement, assessment, and we need continually to make decisions. We can't keep on postponing decisions. We need to come to a judgment. And sometimes we make terrible mistakes. There are miscarriages of justice in society, which sometimes are done by mistake, sometimes by prejudice, sometimes by manipulation of the evidence, either by the police or by the court, or by some other interested parties. In Britain in the 1970s, there were a number of people, they were called the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six, who were arrested for and tried and found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for being responsible for IRA bombings. And they served 16 years in prison, on average, I think, and were then finally exonerated. They were found that the evidence was fake. 16 years of their lives wasted. And today, Cardinal Pell, George Pell, was exonerated from a judgment made against him for sexual abuse last year, I think, and for which he was found guilty and sent to prison, humiliated, and now has been by the Supreme Court in Australia. So when we see, and we have to obey the laws. If the court finds him guilty, he goes to prison. If he's found innocent, he's released. Now, there will be people who are deeply offended and outraged and hurt by an injustice. There's nothing they can do about it. And there are others who, like the mob sometimes, crying for blood, will have made up their mind before the trial, before the evidence, that somebody is guilty because they need a victim, they need a scapegoat. This is what happened to Jesus. So, all of this simply shows the complexity and the difficulty of achieving justice in human society, but how it is a continuous struggle. What I'm saying is that we need to see the contemplative side of justice, almost the mystical side of justice. And that's expressed by the silence of Jesus during his trial, when they're trying to distort the truth by getting him involved in false questions and false arguments. And all he can do to be truthful and just, justice is the truth, is to be silent. And our own practice of meditation is a work of justice, because we are trying, by laying aside the turmoil of our feelings or our thoughts, we are trying to pay attention to what is. The truth is what is. And the more we become truthful and attentive as a result of our meditation, the easier it will be for us to be just in all our relationships. The work of meditation allows us the calmness of mind and heart, the detachment from prejudice and fixed opinions, in order to obey the fundamental law that is written in our hearts. And to obey, the word obedience is related, St. Benedict reminds us always, is related to listening, a deep listening, a silent listening. And it's this silent listening that gives us the ability to pay attention to detail, to the feelings of others, to the nuances of human relationships, to be sensitive, tuned in to where people are, to be obedient to the people we're with, and sensitive to the moods that they're going through, or the suffering that they're facing. So justice comes from the heart through this work of attention, and it's constantly being rebalanced in daily life through forgiveness, through honesty, through openness to others, by reconciliation, by celebration, but continually it needs continuous consciousness, continuous awareness. And then we see that justice and mercy are not opposed to each other, but they're only united in that deepest act of attention, which is love. To pay attention is to love. So justice, which takes account of the whole picture and of the truth of the whole, justice is a fruit of love. It's we become more just people, both in personal relationships and in society, the more loving we become. So let's just end with a word more about from the Gospel. There are two moments in the trial or the Passion of Jesus where there is violence. Well, apart from the violence against Jesus, one is where Peter, defending Jesus at the moment of his arrest, takes out his sword and strikes the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And Jesus says at that moment, "Don't fight, let them have their way." He's not going to resist this. There's no point in resisting it. Violence is not an option against injustice for Jesus. And so he touches the man's ear and heals it. So at this dark moment, he's still a healer. And the other moment, of course, is where during the trial, Jesus replies to the high priest in a reasonable way. He says, "Well, I said nothing in secret. What I said openly, standing up in the temple." And the soldier standing beside Jesus, hits him, strikes him in the face. And Jesus turns to the soldier and says, "If I have said something wrong, point it out to me. But if I have not said something wrong, why do you strike me?" So I think in that response we see the fundamental law of non-violence. Even when we are victims of injustice, it does not help. It is not right to use violence. It doesn't help the situation. And there is the need for healing even in the midst of a process of injustice when we are victims. Healing can still happen even in those dark moments. So this is the second sort of theme I wanted to raise about the Holy Week, the nature of justice. The trial is an important part of the story, I think.